So today we're gonna do maybe a EQ equalizer conversation thing, specifically oriented to Fabfilter. Maybe I'll go through and talk about every Fabfilter plugin individually, but today is going to be about the equalizer. And maybe pros and cons, but like for most Fabfilter plugins, I don't really have any like complaints. But anyways, so Fabfilter Q, you can find tons and tons of videos on Fabfilter Q or Pro Q2. This isn't Q1, and there are many interesting things you can do with it, all of which I do not fully understand because like I never use any MIDI functions that come in here. All I use essentially are the channel mode functions and from time to time the latency functions. Sorry, not latency, but phase functions. And the presets are not anything impressive. And then you also have an A/B, which lets you like compare types of, like you can do like an EQ could be compare between the two EQs you do. This is like, I use this all the time for mastering. Very, very important thing to have for making minor differences. You can quickly switch back and forth if you have multiple things that you were using to, like multiple bands down at the same time. So what's cool about Fabfilter is like quite a few equalizers actually. You have things such as like bands. Fabfilter does not have unlimited bands like people might think. It actually only has 24 maximum bands. Is it 24, 32, or 36? One of those three numbers, I believe. It's not unlimited. It definitely does stop around somewhere around 30. Maybe we'll do right now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Nope. 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. So 24 bands is the max, so the first number I had said. So you can't get any more bands after this. So basically, this is the best EQ ever here, this equalizer that I have created for myself. This is gonna make all your mixes sound better if you put this on the master, guaranteed. Totally, especially if you make some of them left, some of them right. Oh yeah, that's the stuff. No, so yeah, definitely not. I was just kidding. So yeah, it has 24 bands, which is really good because I know for whatever reason people seem to feel like they need more than like 6 to 10 bands on an equalizer. This is like one of Image Line's faced issues from their community. Is they're like, people are like, oh, I want infinite bands like Fabfilter. Fabfilter doesn't have infinite bands. It only has 24. It would be a technological error to have an EQ that has infinite bands. In fact, having 24 bands on an EQ is very impressive. That's like a big deal. Believe it's like, I think analog equalizers usually have around 24, like the big ones, like the fancy analog equalizers. Just because like 24 is all you need, because if they all have like relative Q values, like if I move this and then I start to move, like if you were to add 24 bands across this whole thing, why does it keep doing that? Okay, essentially at some point, like if you keep adding 24 bands, you can see how like they affect each other because of their Q. You turn down this Q, and this is essentially the point of having so many bands, is on like an analog equalizer, for example, is you can have 24, but then the Q value will probably be adjusted just to the point where like it's fairly flat amongst each other. So that way you can do more or less volume raising of frequencies instead of like precision, like precise like cuts or incisions or anything like that. So when you have something like this, you can lower the volume of each individual one, and then they react to each other. So this is why most analog EQs would have like around 24 or whatever, and this is essentially how they would move the spectrum. And then they wouldn't really have too much individual Q control. It was more of just volume leveling for a spectrum. But that's like what EQs are essentially meant to do, is just to control volumes of the spectrum, control volumes of frequencies in a spectrum. However, modern technology has brought us with Fabfilter and other plugins that have things like this, which are like ridiculously precise, like cuts, which you have variable decibels per octave. It's very helpful, so you can get like kind of like a square, because essentially 96 decibels per octave is like really stupidly extremely intense, and this is like a abomination, really. So basically image line, they only have like 6 or 7 EQ bands. Fabfilter has 24. 24 is quite a lot for software. Definitely more than you need. Like, I would say rarely would you need more than one EQ. So like, for example, the reason you would need like a stupidly large EQ in EDM would be for like a hard style kick. If you ever had to use more than one, like if you had to use like more than like 24 EQ bands to in like one plugin or whatever to like make your sound, your kick, you would have like one like pre-EQ or sound like pre-EQ or more of like a creative effect EQ, which is part of the sound design process, and then you have an EQ that's part of the mixing process. So in most situations, though, all of your EQs are part of the mixing process, such as like cutting low end or high end and then compressing it or whatever. You're technically supposed to EQ after compression. You're actually supposed to EQ before and after compression, because the mixing equalizer technically goes after the compressor on a track before master compression. But that doesn't really matter if you're just making something like EDM and like obviously not ultra professional music or whatever. And yeah, so you don't actually need that many bands. You might have to reevaluate your sound design if you're complaining about the amount of bands in Fabfilter, or even like a 7-band filter. You have to reevaluate your sound design or what it is you're doing, because like you're starting to you're going to get ridiculous phasing problems, because EQs work entirely on phase. So that's what's cool about this filter, is you have zero latency, natural phase, linear phase options, which are very cool. So you have like zero latency, which is like modeled after it's supposed to like simulate real life. However, zero latency is more precise than real life analog EQs. Normal phase is the regular, how an analog EQ would affect it. Zero is for like the maximum perfect phasing. So when you do this, it makes as minimal phasing problems as possible. So like when I lower my EQ, essentially what it's going to do is it will use phasings by like creating the same waves through sine waves to eliminate this volume by targeting those frequencies with like some advanced processing. I don't know the ultra technical parts of it, but essentially it removes volume or adds through phasing and targeting those frequencies specified by all your parameters. And so that's cool, because like Fabfilter is known for having like the most precise and high accuracy equalizer. Natural Phase is more towards like waves plugins. Their EQs would be very much targeted at natural phase, because they want to get the point of waves is to get the analog sound, not this ultra crazy like synthetic one. Then you have linear, which is actually the first type of like EQs that were created for software. Now linear EQs are more of like a technological weirdness. So because the way they do their phasing is actually specific to each frequency band and the difference between the next frequency band, you end up with something that actually phases perfectly, so there's no volume loss. So this is completely different from natural and zero latency. Zero latency, add a bell, lower the frequency, lower the volume of these frequencies. That's it. Linear phase, come here, lower these frequencies. Not actually, you've just changed the harmonic content, similar into the way where you mess with like, similarly to the way that you do this nonsense here. Essentially, you're messing with like the actual timbre and properties of the sound without losing volume because of how precision or like how calculated the phasing is. So this is called like linear phase. And then you have options of like how extreme your linear phase is, like maximum being like the craziest and like so delayed. Look at the milliseconds. This will get you, this is like for like extreme mastering purposes, and you probably wouldn't even use maximum. You'd probably sit around somewhere around high or medium, but this will kill like your delay time. So this is like for mastering, and to be honest, as someone who does mixing and mastering, I don't actually use linear phase very often. Minimum phase is usually pretty good, assuming the mix itself doesn't need any work to be done, any hardcore work that needs to be done or whatever. And I usually only take like well done mixes, because there's less stuff for people to complain about there. So also we have the left and right. So essentially what this does is put a band, you have a left right option, and in the middle one stands for like stereo sync. So make this left, this is now only left, this is now only right. Now this is both. If you tell it to, at any point, if you have a band and you split it, it makes left and right always. There's a split butt option on the bottom. Hey, this would have been a good way to test how many bands you could have. Yeah, there's a bunch of bands in here now. And so that's the left right option. So obviously if I add something here, okay, coming in here, and then the right. This gets you really cool effects for atmospheres if you do like band passes, and then you tighten them up a bit and then split them, and you actually modulate these separately from each other. You'll never get anything more funky sounding in stereo fields than that. And that's really cool. So there's stuff called like stereo enhancers, which are, here we are. So this would use it. Sorry, here it is. So this is more of like a piano string kind of concept, is doing weird stuff like this. I do it very often when I'm trying to mix pianos into like acoustic stuff. Like if I have like acoustic guitar and then like an electric guitar with some ambient stuff and all that, and I want the piano to be more in the background. There's a lot of weirdness that goes on with the left and right, but for this here, mostly you're not going to use left and right, you're going to use mid and side. So you can target side frequencies of things or mid frequencies of things. I have like a preset here for mastering, which looks like this, and this is where I do my like mastering stuff. So this just kind of like cleans up everything. This essentially just gets rid of the other 5K that's in here that you don't actually properly hear on any playback system you listen to EDM in. There's nothing important here, so I cut that. And then at the same time, this also gets rid of aliasing, like up in the 30K. So it's like killing two birds with one stone. This is like what's called a brick wall. So these create like many, they can create many problems, but like it doesn't really matter for like any purpose of EDM. This is something you wouldn't do for high quality trailer orchestral music, essentially. Like this is like technically ruining your sound, but like you're not going to notice, you're not going to hear it. All you're going to hear is that the aliasing, you can sense and feel in like high playbacks, and it does affect the way the rest of the frequencies react once they go into compression, is the aliasing. So EQing aliasing is actually done. So that's why this EQ of Fabfilter goes up to 30K, is because up here in this area, there is EQing that can be done up here, which seems ridiculous, but yes, there can be things that are done up here that will minorly change the way the rest of the frequencies can react to the compression. And like the whole, because you can tell if you listen to something being played into a room, and then you had that same thing being played the exact same way, being recorded through a mic that captured exactly what your ears could hear in the exact same spot, in the exact same way you were observing it, and you played it back, but all you did was cut this. So essentially you're listening to it two times, once without this high cut at like 20K, and then once with the high cut. Even though you can't hear past 20K, you can hear the difference, and people always like, not my colleagues, but like people, like friends or whatever I talk to, they're like, oh no, you're crazy, that doesn't even make sense. Trust me, it's a thing. You can hear or sense aliasing when you cut off 20K. You will hear. You can. It does change. It changes like the completeness of a room or a sound. Just not explaining it super technologically or whatever. And then there's some mid here. This one's at 30. I don't know why. This one's at 30. I don't know why. They're usually here or something. And this just kind of like lowers the side a bit as it gets down to the lower end where it's not needed, and then kind of raises it a little bit over here because I like my mixes to have stereo in them. And then you'll notice this is on 0 latency. This would not be on linear phase. There's a MIDI learn option for this. So yeah, so this is basically just like if you want to hook up stuff to like your MIDI controllers. It's not working on my MIDI controller, probably because it's not like a recognized one. And then you have like types of graphs, like intensities or whatever. I would recommend like staying at 12 or actually 6. 6 can be quite nice, or 3 if you really want to have precision. You can change this. I might actually drop this down to 6, for example. I'll delete all these bands, leave it at 6 in mid-side mode, and then come in, save as. What we can do is go find the default here, like that, save. place. You can always undo that later. So then you notice every time I come to the default now, this is actually new. I didn't used to do this before. It wouldn't save your scale. But now when I come into my default, it's automatically at 6, which is nice because then there's more precision behind it. Requires a little bit more moving of the mouse, but then when it's like this, you really, really take into consideration what you're doing, because it's like up here is 6, so like usually around here is 6. So then you get here, but once you get here, you realize, oh, it's only 3, and then you really think about like what you're doing, and then you actually go back to like thinking about, and you actually go back to like using your ears, whatever. And then I also like the steepness of the cuts, the way they look here, make me feel a little like safer in my mind. And that is about it for this plugin. If you want a full screen, you can full screen. There's bypass option, size option. If you're using VST3, I believe you can click and drag and stretch. You have some tilt options for like the frequency spectrum that's being played back. Some range, I recommend 90. 90 is a pretty standard decibel viewing range. I like to use these on maximum and very fast. This will affect performance while the equalizer is open, but not when it's closed. And then again, you have the option, do you want to view post spectrum? Take that off. You won't see post spectrum. You just see pre, or you can see only the post and you can't see, or you can just take this off, so that way you don't, for the weaker minded, you don't like see something being done and then be like, oh, that makes a big improvement. That's good for people who haven't yet trained their ears to listen while they can view physical like data in front of them, which usually newer producers, you want to practice the ear training first, and then once you get a sense of how an EQ works with your ears, then you're more ready to move on to being able to listen to your changes of an EQ while viewing the physical data and actually doing things with numbers in your head, but then still being able to hear how it sounds and then making estimations of what numbers you're trying to go towards. And then you have like a sidechain. Oh yeah, this is nice. Spectrum grab. So if you like have something playing, it holds like the frequencies up in the area. I'm not sure what this exactly does. You drag to adjust. What? Weird. Anyways, yeah, that's the thing. And then so I like to have these on. There's an EQ match option here, and what I like about Fabfilter is like everything tells you what it does. There's also a nice little bypass button in here. Fabfilter will tell you it's on, like with this red line. So if you ever see this red line, you know it's on. There's a phase invert mode, which you would never have to worry about. Then you have like auto gain. So this probably isn't something I'd recommend using unless it was for creative purposes, but that's kind of like what the linear phase EQ does, except it doesn't actually have to auto gain after you lower something. So I'm not entirely sure what the point of that would be, but it's there. And then you have the output meter. You can take that on or off if you want. And that's about it.